All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on German idealism and post-Kantian thought. Today, we're going to mix it up. We're going to fly over to France and we're going to be talking about Henri Bergson with a very special guest who you all have requested multiple times. And I now have Dr. Herring here with me to discuss the life and philosophy of Henri Bergson. So thank you for being here, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So Dr. Emily Herring is a writer based in Paris. She studied philosophy at the Sorbonne and received her PhD in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Leeds. Her work has appeared in TLS and Aeon, and in October of 2024, Emily published Herald of a Restless World: How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People, the first English language biography of Henri Bergson, the French philosopher who defined individual creativity and transformed 20th century thought. So, in the book, in Herald of a Restless World, Emily Herring recovers how Bergson captivated a society in flux. She shows how his celebration of the time-bending uniqueness of individual experience struck a chord with those shaken by modern technological and social change long after he faded from public view. His insights into memory, time, laughter, and creativity continue to shape how we see the world around us. So this book sounds fascinating and it is getting rave reviews from everywhere. And so I'm very happy to have you here, and I can't thank you enough.
Well,
For
thank you. Thank you for having me.
maybe we can start off with why Henri Bergson? What makes him important for our time, and why did you write a book about Henri Bergson?
So to take the second question first, I, as you mentioned, did my postgrad, my PhD studies in the UK, and there I was quite surprised to find that no one had heard of Bergson because I came from France where he's still, as at least in philosophical circles, remembered. Whereas in the UK and in the English-speaking world in general, the legacy of Bertrand Russell kind of into the forgotten pile of sort of history has really taken a hold. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, reintroduce the English speaking world to Bergson. And one of the things I was really struck by when I was researching the book was that early 20th century, a lot of the thousands and thousands of readers Bergson had were drawn to him for reasons that I think for a certain version of existential anxiety that I think is echoed today. So to answer sort of why return to Bergson today, in the early 20th century, there's all these anxieties about the ways in which quantification and mechanization are kind of seeping in to areas of human life where they previously hadn't sort of been. And Bergson, with his description of sort of creativity, of freedom, and also his refusal to accept, quantified versions of theories of consciousness, really resonates still, I think, and would we would probably gain a lot from revisiting some of these ideas in a time now when we're very anxious about, ways in which algorithms quantify us and put us into sort of very rigid boxes that are then used for capitalistic gain and political reasons, and also the so-called AI, generative AI, the way in which we're told these are creative machines, but then if you look at it more closely, it's kind of rehashing pre-existing human creations. So I think the thinker of creativity, temporality, consciousness, that was Bergson, has a lot to say to the present day, and has a lot to say to maybe ways in which Anglophone philosophy has, followed so, this opens up different ways of doing philosophy, I would say.
No, I think that's a great I think that's a great response. I think it's what you're doing is extremely important work. Um, And there seems to be a kind of revival of Bergson going on right now. And hopefully your book brings a lot more attention to his thought. So thank you very much for that lovely and rich answer. I was wondering if you could maybe perhaps provide a brief biography of Bergson's life. Now, it doesn't have to be super exhaustive. It
Mhm.
can just be some of the main events that you think are the most important. And if you'd like to take us away, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So he's born in 1859, which coincidentally is the same year that Darwin publishes The Origin of Species, which is relevant because Bergson goes on to really think about evolution. He was born in a fairly poor family. His father was a kind of struggling composer. And he excelled at school from a very young age, and so he was able to get all these scholarships. And so around his 10th birthday, the family were based in Paris, and he got all these scholarships. And the family sort of then moved to London to further the father's career, but Bergson stayed alone in France. He really just rose the academic ladder, the French academic ladder, sort of doing everything in the right order and excelling every step of the way, kind of thing. And around the early 1880s, that's when he kind of comes up with his idea of durée. Up until then, he'd been a big fan of Herbert Spencer, but then he completely shifts. He has this sort of complete change of heart, going from a mechanistic sort of view of the world to what then becomes his philosophy. And this first book is sort of noticed in, so it's his PhD dissertation, also his first book is noticed in French academic circles. His second book, Matter and Memory, is even more noticed in French academic circles, but it's around sort of 1900 when he gets a lectureship at the Collège de France, which is this slightly odd French institution that still exists to this day, where they have some of the best sort of scholars, but there's no enrollment, there's no exams, it's all public lectures. So he gets a position there after being rejected by the Sorbonne a few times. He manages to get a job at the Collège de France. And it's around this time, after a few years there, where he really starts, his sort of renown really kicks off, and he starts to get hundreds of people coming to his lectures. Um, People even start sort of sending they start saving a seat in the lecture that's before his lecture, or sending their valet to save a seat, so it starts to get kind of out of hand. And then this all really takes off around 1907, and then especially 1910. 1907 is when he publishes Creative Evolution, his third major book. I didn't count Laughter is 1900, but so Creative Evolution 1907, and then translated into English and other languages around 1910. Complete explosion of Bergson mania, to a point that seems hard to believe nowadays because he's been so forgotten, but he was quite literally around this time and up until sort of the end of World War I or the early 20s, literally one of the most famous people on the planet. You know, people fainting during his lectures because of how many people were in the room. He causes the first traffic jam on Broadway when he lectures at Columbia University in New York. People are kind of stalking him. It's everything deranged about what we now call celebrity culture was kind of happening to him. And then World War I breaks out, and at this point, he gives a bunch of speeches that are considered quite nationalistic, kind of very emotional speeches. Um, and then later during the war, the French government send him to the US to basically convince President Wilson to join, that the US should join the war. And they do this because they think sending a diplomat would be seen as too aggressive. So they send a philosopher instead, the most famous philosopher, knowing that President Wilson would probably, because he was quite a scholarly man, would probably be swayed by someone like Bergson. Um, After the war, he kind of stops lecturing, and he's very invested in the nascent kind of League of Nations. So he's part of this advisory board for the League of Nations, alongside Albert Einstein and the Curies, and not the Curies because Pierre Curie was dead, but Marie Curie was there and other people like that. In 1922, he has this kind of infamous public debate with Einstein, where he's sort of reluctantly he joins a debate. Einstein's invited to Paris. Bergson's in the audience. Wasn't planning on sort of having anything to do with it. But it's kind of inevitable at the same time because he's the philosopher of durée, and here we have the thinker of relativity. He launches on this really long expose about why, while he agrees with the mathematics of relativity, the philosopher still has something to add. And Einstein kind of destroys him with a one-liner saying, the time of the philosopher does not exist. And this kind of cements and it accelerates a kind of period of downfall where he disappears from the public view, also because at this point he's quite ill. And so for the final 20 years of his life, he's got this horrendous kind of rheumatoid arthritis. He's still working on his final book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, which comes out in 1932. But at this point, he can barely he's got immense fatigue. And he dies in Nazi-occupied Paris in 1941 after having refused exemption the Vichy collaborationist government had offered him exemption from the anti-Semitic laws that were being put in place because he was a Nobel Prize winner, because he was this figure of French philosophy. He refused, and he contracted pneumonia from standing in line to register as a Jew in the sort of really harsh winter. And dies, early 1941, after allegedly giving an hour-long philosophy lecture on his deathbed, which is a story I've read from various sources, and then ending with, gentlemen, it's 5 o'clock, class is over, and then he died.
Seems to have such a rich and wonderful life, but also tragic towards the end as well. Let me just ask you one quick question, side question. Did that comment from Einstein, do you think, really affected him? Did it affect him in the sense that, oh, well, philosophy is now done. This is the age of science. Do you think that affected him, or?
He was upset that he felt that he'd engaged really seriously, and he had done, with Einstein's work. And he was among the few people, I think, who were able to, he was, contrary to the ways in which he's been painted, he was really proficient in mathematics and physics and the sciences of his day. So he'd taken Einstein very seriously, and I think he was slightly hurt that Einstein had never engaged seriously with his work. And then what happened is that this sort of event launched a series of satellite debates. And at this point, Bergson himself was starting to be ill, exhausted, not able to really respond in the way that he would have wanted. And so it kind of, I think that exhausted him at a point when he was already, burnt out from almost 15 years of absolute madness, and the war that had just happened and things like that. So, but it's certainly, Canales, in her book, there's a whole book about this one debate that Jimena Canales has written, and she kind of pinpoints this as it kind of marks the moment when, scientists are seen as holding more authority than all other forms of knowledge or all other scholars combined, kind of thing. So she kind of pinpoints it as an important moment in sort of intellectual history.
Wow. So my next question is Bergson's philosophical and maybe even scientific influences as well too.
Mhm.
Who do you think, in your opinion, really influenced his work? And it can be both critically, and it can also be influenced, like positive influences. I know sometimes philosophers have these negative, or not negative, they have their influences sometimes, are critical
Mhm.
from their perspective.
Yeah, so Bergson is interesting because he very rarely cites sources when he, as you say, sort of the influences that positive influences. He spends a lot of time being anti-Kantian and being anti-Spencer. So Spencer was the thinker, Herbert Spencer, British philosopher, 19th century philosopher. Bergson was super into Spencer in his sort of late teens, early 20s, and then built himself completely against Spencer. So himself initially as a philosopher of science who would continue Spencer's synthetic philosophy, and he saw philosophy as coming to the aid of science. And he kind of completely reverses what he thinks the relationship between science and philosophy is when he has his big sort of breakthrough moment. And then the other, yeah, he also built himself in reaction to Kant because in French academia at the time and at the École Normale Supérieure where he studied, you were either, to put it in a quite caricatural terms, you were either a Kantian, a neo-Kantian, I guess, or a positivist. And Bergson sort of builds himself against Kant. In particular, so in his first book, Time and Free Will, there's kind of a lot about the ways in which he thinks Kant is wrong about time. So those are kind of, I see those as huge influences of Bergson, even though they're negative influences. And then there's kind of, he's very influenced again, perhaps negatively, positively by some of the more obscure French thinkers obscure now kind of French thinkers of his time. So people like Jules Lachelier and Ravesson and all these thinkers that have been forgotten now in the Anglophone world. Some of whom were his teachers. He's definitely responding to that philosophy of his time. And then what I find really interesting if you look at his work, for someone who's so often accused of being anti-science, which is sort of demonstrably false, the way he engages seriously with the science of his time and actually I think reads more of the empirical sciences than he does the philosophy of his time, is really interesting. So he's in Creative Evolution, he's kind of read every single the rival evolutionary theories of the time. He's sort of and in Matter and Memory, it's all to do with neurophysiology, and he's painstaking detail about aphasia and things like that. And similarly, as I've mentioned before with Einstein, so I don't know if that counts as influence. It's more that's the primary matter that he's working with actually is the philosophy of his day, and he was quite ignorant of some of his contemporaries, I would say, in philosophy. So I hope that answers a little bit.
No, that's great. Actually, it's interesting. The two philosophers you cited,
Mhm,
Lechelier and
mhm.
Ravesson, are the two philosophers that's where I learned about Bergson. So I was
Right.
really interested in Ravesson's work and talking to Mark St. Clair in England
Mm,
about Ravesson, and then read Bergson's, I think he's got like a little like a bio
yeah.
philosophical pick or yeah, treatise on Ravisson's philosophy. So that's where I learned about Bergson, actually, believe it
And
or not.
actually, Mark Sinclair's work so he's got the Routledge book Bergson, which is a bit of a textbook, really, but it's brilliant. And I do think there's a chapter that's a bit of an intellectual biography chapter, and I do think he mentions these thinkers quite a bit. And he's done quite good work on Bergson's influences and the way that French philosophy was at the time and how that fed into to Bergson, who himself often presents himself as utterly original, and then you look at what was going on around him, and there was a lot going on.
Can you maybe talk about what Bergson means by creativity and freedom?
Mhm. Yeah, so in terms of creativity and the way he uses it for, say, in creative evolution, um, it is I guess it could be misleading because if you're talking about evolution and the term creation or creativity is coming into play, you immediately think of creationism when that's absolutely not the case. He's talking about the absolute unpredictability of evolution and the way in which the spontaneity, I guess, of life as a movement, and despite kind of all the obstacles that life has faced in its environment and all the various kind of adaptations it's had to take on. At the heart of it, there is this urge towards freedom and towards more creativity, an urge towards liberating life, liberating itself from inert matter, kind of thing. So creativity, in that sense, it has more to do with being opposed to either a mechanical, deterministic view of life or a teleological view of life, because in both of these views, in a sense, everything is given in advance, both in the completely deterministic view where in theory you should be able to predict the position of any molecule, and in a teleological vision of evolution, similarly, there's a plan that's in front of you, and he's sort of creativity. It's kind of in opposition to both of those ideas. This idea that in the same way that according to him you cannot predict the next conscious state, based on previous conscious states, with life the same applies, the evolution of life. And so in human consciousness, and it ties into durée. So which I'm sure we'll get to in a bit, but just the idea that for a conscious being, you never go through the same state twice because of the kind of accumulation of experience. And so for that reason, you can't apply sort of deterministic causality to a consciousness, because that presupposes that from the same causes, the same effects, but you never get the same cause twice in consciousness. And he kind of treats the whole of the evolution of life as he does consciousness, in a sense. There's sort of a shared history that's almost something like memory. And so that's where freedom comes in as well. That's sort of one of his, again, anti-deterministic arguments. I find Creative Evolution to be one of his most beautiful texts. It's a very difficult book, and maybe that's why it was a bestseller in his day, because it's yeah, it's an inspiring book.
My favorite idea about creative evolution, this blew me away when I first read it. He's talking about mollusks or octopus or squids, I think,
Yeah.
way below the water. And his question
Mhm.
is like, where did the eye come from? How did this eye form in this, sea creature that's millions of leagues in the water, not millions, sorry, thousands of leagues in water. And and how did the rods and codes and how did the eye form, um, I guess through evolution, um, when there's not a lot of light right?
Yeah.
This blew me away. I actually had to think about this for a while. I was, in public transit reading this, going, whoa, thinking about this on my way back. But
And
yeah,
he's taking these questions really seriously. All of the debates, and the early 20th century was such um, a quite chaotic time actually for evolutionary science, because it wasn't that there was, the Darwinian way and that was it. There were, at least four or five major competing
yeah.
theories of evolution. So he was having to contend with all of that, as well as sort of inserting himself as a metaphysician among all these biologists. Um,
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And this is fan. I love how our dialogue is just it's kind of creating its own kind of freedom right now. We're hitting all the marks at the same time, but you're also doing a great job of disclosing all of these really difficult ideas for us. So, um, maybe we could now shift just to, we were talking about Bergson being an absolutely, just a celebrity at the time,
mhm.
just so famous, a famous philosopher people were flocking to, and just the way that you were describing, valets, saving spots, and from the past lecture also. How do you think his global stardom affected his life, his work, and even his health?
Mm. Yeah, he absolutely hated it, actually, when you sort of look at his correspondence a little bit. Um, because he worried, first of all, because he worried it meant that other philosophers took him less seriously, which to a certain extent he was correct, they did. Um, and there was all this bad press about him, and the bad press being, oh, well, lots of women are attending his lectures, so, he can't be a very good philosopher if women are into his philosophy. And it also meant that he attracted a lot of quite vicious attacks from the anti-Semitic far right in France, where they accused him of not only destroying the French ideal. So he wasn't French because Jewish, according to them. And he was destroying this centuries-long tradition of Cartesian rationalism by being a thinker of intuition, by being a thinker of what they thought to be the irrational. And also, these views were feminine, according to them, whereas rationalism is inherently masculine. So he was kind of described by them as responsible for the decline of sort of French civilization or whatever. But these were horrible, horrible, vicious attacks that he had to sort of contend with. Um, and it also just meant that he didn't have as much time as he would have wanted to just, sit quietly and think, which is what philosophers tend to like to do. And he felt that he was having to take part in so many social events that he wasn't interested in that kind of thing. And it really just broke him. And it broke his body. And, what we now call burnout. I think he had at several points in his life where he would just end up being really ill for long periods of time. Um, and it's interesting because it is quite rare for a philosopher to have that level of stardom. I guess in France there have been quite a few. It's other Collège de France lecturers, actually, for instance, Foucault was a Collège de France lecturer. But no, I think it was horrible for him, and it wasn't something that he had tried to. He wasn't looking for fame. He was ambitious professionally, but he wasn't at all expecting. And the other thing that was hard was that it also meant that his philosophy was being caricatured and simplified, and he found that it had these applications that he'd never intended, both in political ways. So in the early 20th century, there would be um, revolutionary syndicalists who were claiming to be Bergsonian when he was quite a bit of a centrist, actually, what we would now call a centrist. He didn't recognize himself in that. And then all the artistic movements claiming to be Bergsonian, the Cubists and the Futurists. And again, he was like, I've never seen their art. I don't know what this is all about. So it was all very confusing, and it created a lot of noise and confusion around him that he just felt was not conducive to good, sound philosophy, as you can imagine.
Yeah, no, I can definitely imagine that. And that's oof. Um, it's a terrible that's a terrible thing to happen when you're presenting your ideas in your work and you're not being taken seriously, or being your arguments are being taken charitably and you're being caricatured.
Mhm.
So now we're kind of shifting again. We're moving more to his philosophy again. Um, so how did Bergson come up with this like central notion that we've brought up multiple times? I'm going to butcher the French. It's terrible because I'm Canadian and I should be speaking much better French. La durée, I think. And
Mhm.
how did it differ from conceptions of the time? So maybe scientific and philosophical.
hmm So I've already mentioned sort of when Bergson was a student, he was really into Herbert Spencer, and his plan was to write a PhD thesis that would be a continuation of Spencer's project. And so in order to do this, he started studying the concepts of the mechanics of his day, one of them being time. And the way he describes it in his kind of few autobiographical moments is that he was surprised when he did this to realize that the letter T in the equations of mechanics representing time contain no temporality at all. Um, the other story he tells usually has to do with him explaining Zeno's paradox to his students and realizing, oh, that Zeno has not proved that movement is impossible. He's just proved that you can sort of divide a line into as many segments as you want. So this kind of put him on the right track on the track at least of Durée as well. But the central idea is that time, as it is represented in scientific equations, even in everyday language, even in quite a lot of the history of Western philosophy, um, as I said, contains no temporality at all. It is spatialized time. It's time that has been stopped in its tracks and treated like moments in time are treated like objects in space, interchangeable, juxtaposed. He has a thought experiment that I think is quite useful in his first book to kind of explain what durée is not, or what scientists have to get rid of when they're trying to measure time. He imagines an evil demon, not unlike Descartes' sort of evil genie, but this one is a kind of temporal genie, and rotation of the Earth on its axis would happen in 12 hours instead of 24 hours. All other phenomena would accelerate proportionally. Um, to the equations of the astrophysicist, this would make no difference because all proportions would have been preserved. But to the astrophysicist, to anyone experiencing this change in tempo, there would be a huge difference felt. It wouldn't necessarily be understood as a quantitative change immediately, but there would be a sense, an internal sense that the usual storage of experience, accumulation of experiences is different, has been different between sunrise and sunset. And that's the idea that this is precisely what we have to remove um, if we want to be able to measure and if we want to be able to quantify. To kind of express what durée is, it's a bit of a challenge because there's a sense in which even the language we use, it kind of tricks us into spatializing our own internal states. Um, but Bergson tries to get around this by using a lot of analogies and metaphors and images. And one that he uses is music, melody, and that might be because I like to think it's from his father's job as a composer, that he was so into music. But this idea that music can be transcribed into a succession of symbols. This is a very useful way of communicating music and recording it. And on a sheet of paper, each note can be erased, moved around. They're all interchangeable. They all represent this kind of homogeneous unit. But when we listen to music, we don't experience a succession, a juxtaposition of notes in space. What we experience is something a lot more organic, something in which what we are experiencing in the present is completely informed by everything that's come before, and there's no clear before and after between each note. And if one note were to be displaced, it would just mean that we have a completely different melody. Notes are not interchangeable. Notes are not, you don't go through the same sequence, even if you hear the same note over and over again. The sheer fact that you've heard that note several times informs the way you experience it. So that is basically the difference between sort of mathematical time and durée in consciousness, because then later he kind of has this almost cosmological um, uh, way of thinking about durée with evolution. But that's the initial surprise he talks about um, between mathematical time and durée. But it's always a challenge to try and summarize, and because it kind of is an idea that resists conceptualization by its very nature, which is always a bit odd.
I guess in your book you're highlighting things like Bergson didn't really believe that he had a philosophical system,
Mhm.
and that and he kind of stresses the originality of memory and freedom, evolution of life. Now, you had mentioned that his last work was on morality.
Mhm.
So how does he see, the brain, evolution, life, and morality coming into the picture?
Yeah, so on the idea that he doesn't have a system, this is something that's very important to him. And what he means by this is he believes that a new problem means that you start from scratch. And that he often says, you know, you couldn't sort of deduce my second book from my first book, or you couldn't even see where I'm going next. And he was very opposed to the idea that his ideas could be applied to other problems. And he hated it when journalists would come up to him and say, "What are your thoughts on insert sort of political," because he said, I don't have more to say about this than any other person because I haven't spent time thinking about it. So come back in a few years and maybe I'll have had time to properly think about this. And he said, you know, in a lifetime, you can only hope to study two, three, maybe four problems. That's it. And anyone who claims otherwise is not doing things properly. So that's just gives you a feel for, I guess, how he views philosophy in a way, or the work as a philosopher. Um, and so, yeah, how does he get from individual consciousness and sort of problems to do with ways in which consciousness cannot be spatialized or quantified to huge questions about morality and religion, um, basically 50, 60 years later? There's no straightforward answer to that. I was always interested in the way creative evolution came about, for instance, where he starts so he starts from sort of individual consciousness with time and free will. Then he kind of gets into, okay, how do we incorporate the world into this, in matter and memory? And then in between matter and memory and creative evolution, there's this really interesting article he publishes called Introduction to Metaphysics in 1903, where he it's the closest we'll get, I think, to some kind of discourse on the method by Bergson, but where he gets to this point where he says, well, you know, we use language and concepts to tidy up the overwhelming diversity of reality into sort of neat, tidy boxes. But in doing so, we often lose sight of what is unique and special and about the various aspects of reality that we're trying to study. And actually, there is one way of studying the world, which is analytical or analysis, he calls it, which consists in basically multiplying these conceptual abstract takes, and you can sort of add layers upon layers of abstraction and complexity, but never exhaust the object you're trying to study. But then there's this other um, way of apprehending reality, which is intuition, which he unfortunately called intuition, and he later regretted because what he means by intuition is not something, it's not a vibe, it's not this passive sort of reception of, it's something very active. He calls it a sort of effort, by which we should be able to undo sort of the deeply, deeply ingrained habits of the mind and be, you know, he calls metaphysics the science that claims to dispense with symbols, which obviously is a bit of a contradiction in terms. And the reason I'm saying all of this is that so in 1903, he's got this idea of intuition, which would be how we would be able to consider reality if we weren't kind of saturated with all these spatialized conceptual takes of reality. And then creative evolution is basically him trying to think, okay, well, how is intuition possible? Well, we should look at the history of the human intellect. We should consider there's no way that we're going to understand life properly if we don't have a good theory of knowledge. And theory of knowledge itself is inscribed because the intellect is a product of evolution. The theory of knowledge itself has to be inscribed in the theory of life. And then so he gets to this vision of the human intellect as essentially extremely practical and tool oriented, and you know, having come around as a solution to the obstacles of inert matter, and a way of mastering those. He looks at intuition in the animal life and in human life as another solution adopted by life to sort of, instead of taking the point of view of inert matter, it's kind of a vision of life from the inside of life itself, but without the self-reflexivity of human intelligence. And then intuition is kind of made possible by the fact that we have these tendencies in ourselves, and that there's the kind of internal vision that is made possible by instinct, but then the self-reflexivity that is made possible by the intellect. Again, all of this to say that I think that's a place where we see a nice progression of his ideas. And I think two sources of morality and religion that then comes out 25 years after creative evolution, because he's only able to work a few hours a day, if that, because he's so ill and life has become so difficult. It's then him, I think, expanding even further these ideas of the ability to catch a glimpse. Intuition isn't this made possible, as I said, by the contact with the intellect itself, and it's only a sort of fleeting glimpse of sort of despatialized, deconceptualized reality. But this gets him onto mysticism. He becomes very interested in the figure of the mystic sort of throughout human history. And within mysticism, he includes people like Socrates, and sort of all the prophets and all, anyone who he thinks, has had the ability to be in direct contact with something like divinity, meaning kind of the very movement of life itself, and then been able to communicate it back to the rest of us. And that's something that artists kind of have a little bit as well in Bergson, but not in the same way. And so I think that's why he then gets really into thinking about morality and religion. But it's really hard to trace. It has to be retrospectively that we trace this path, and that's something he would critique. He would say, it's only we're recomposing a vision of evolution with actually things that are sort of static parts because we already have everything. But that's what I've attempted to do here.
No, no, I don't think you attempted. I think you completed that task. We went from intuition and you navigated us right through to morality. It's really interesting when you were talking about effort. I gravitated at one point towards Main de Biron and like
Mm.
Cabernet and this. I I don't want to call them vitalists. I guess they were called the
Spirit,
Martians.
they were called in France, Mendelssohn was called a spiritualist, which has nothing to do with, in English, what we think of as spiritualism, the kind of occult, but rather an emphasis on introspection and the soul, I guess, or the spirit, the mind. Sorry for interrupting, but
No, no, no. I'm glad you did like action, right? Like it had to do a
Mhm.
lot with action and resistance. Do you see Bergson in the French spiritualist tradition or even the vitalist tradition at all?
So it's that's actually a really interesting question because he there certainly are clear links between his way of dealing with consciousness and spirit, I guess, and the spiritualists. But at the same time, he has this real pull towards versions of positivism, and actually it's kind of a synthesis between the two, I think, in him, where he thinks of metaphysics as something that can be something like a positive science. If that sounds weird, but it's the idea that there could be metaphysics could be cumulative in the way that the empirical sciences are cumulative, and he has this vision of metaphysics as what the metaphysician is doing is something that the scientist can't hope to do because science is, in essence, practice oriented and interested as opposed to disinterested. And that the metaphysician basically has the luxury, in a sense, of not being oriented towards these practical goals that require measurement, that require quantification, that require concepts to make sense of, the overwhelming diversity of life, for instance, and the overwhelming diversity of the phenomena of organisms, and that we have to be conceptual about them. The metaphysician is someone who doesn't have to deal with those things because the goal is completely different. But science and metaphysics are therefore complementary, and in the same way that what I was saying about kind of intuition relies on the intellect in a sense, in the same way metaphysics relies on the findings of the empirical scientists, and that's why Bergson is always, always, always looking so closely at the findings of the sciences of his time. And so, yeah, there's this, I guess, spiritualist tradition that is infused into him, but also I guess he was also brought up on positivism, and on Spencer's vision of what science is, and so it's a combination of the two in a way, in a very 19th century way, meaning of both of those terms, I guess.
No,
Um,
that's a great answer, and you're highlighting nicely the kind of brilliance of Bergson. One of the great things about doing a series like this is when I ask someone on, and I can see the passion in their eyes when they're talking about someone. You really love Bergson. Like there's this one discussion. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to embarrass you. There was this discussion on Twitter where someone said something like, "Oh, I'll never read Bergson. He's terrible," or something, and you replied, "Oh, well, isn't that a shame?" or something. And I was just like, you had this really nice kind of like witty remark. It was really, really nice. I was like, "Oh, I can tell right away. She loves Bergson." Um,
Even if even if I don't subscribe to everything about him, and but there's something, yeah, I think there's something really cool about him, and I do think he deserves to be taken seriously again by current day philosophers, because the way I've seen, as I was in the UK surrounded by sort of analytic philosophers, the ways in which I saw them reinventing ideas that were kind of Bergsonian, or kind of from other parts of the history of philosophy, I just think it's a shame, because process philosophy nowadays, process philosophy of biology, tend to ignore Bergson completely and sort of go to Whitehead, which is a shame. And there are other areas where I really think um, he can be brought back. And yeah, I do have a picture of him on my desk, so
nice.
I'm pretty far gone in terms of.
No, no, that's great. I love it. I love it. You're so right about this debate and process theory as well too, that they kind of overlook Bergson's im- Bergson's
Because they
importance.
see him as a sort of vitalist, as you were mentioning, unfrequentable kind of vitalist. And very quickly, I just think, it's more complicated than that. He's not a vitalist in the sense of uh, believing that there is an immaterial life force. It's much more subtle than that. And it has to do with the way he sees the difference between what metaphysicians and what scientists are doing. That's all I'll say on that. But it's quite frustrating to see him put in the same bag as some of the vitalists, I guess, of the 19th century.
Which is why I wasn't going to ask you about Elan Vital, because I think that gets really overcharacterized and
Hmm.
really kind of mystified as well too.
Yeah.
Um, but I think you did such a great job of, navigating us through Bergson, and this is a difficult task as well too. And I can't wait to read your book. And there's such great reviews of it. Maybe the last question we can bring up is, in your own opinion, why do you think there has been such a decline over the years in Bergson, his kind of disappearance um, from the face of philosophy?
Yeah, it's interesting because it happened quite quickly, as quickly as he became so famous. He kind of disappeared quite quickly. One reason is that there was no school of Bergsonism, because not only because he didn't have a system, but also he didn't have any students because he was doing public lectures. There's also I mentioned in passing that at the beginning of World War One, he gave a series of speeches. He was in the role of president of the sort of French Academy of Moral and Political Sciences. And in that capacity, he gives these quite intense speeches where he associates the French spirit with a kind of vital impulse, and then he associates the German side with mechanistic barbarism, and it's very nationalistic in tone. But his nationalism didn't go as far as, not wanting to work with German colleagues, as it did in other people contemporary to him. But those speeches were then, after the war, the left, who had once been quite sympathetic to Bergson, had, completely turned on him for understandable reasons, because they saw this as like weird chauvinistic um, take. There's also the World War One itself, I think, had a massive impact. A lot of the the reasons why people were so drawn to him, and the hopes and the ideologies and the ideas pre-World War One kind of were completely destroyed by the war. Either because literally the generation upholding these ideas was lost, or because what counted as a hope or an ideology or whatever had changed after World War One. There was just this huge shift. And finally, what I'd say is Bertrand Russell and some other thinkers, but I think he did a real damage in not only completely misrepresenting Bergson's thought in there's this 1912 article in The Monist that he publishes called The Philosophy of Bergson, where he presents him as sort of anti-science, anti-rationalists, mathematically illiterate, all of which are very easily demonstrably false. Bergson was extremely good at mathematics. He wasn't anti-science. I hope I've made a case for that in this discussion. But Russell reproduces this article in his best-selling History of Western Philosophy that comes out after Bergson's death. And I think that kind of cements it. And also, Anglophone philosophy has taken a trajectory at that point, which is just not compatible with people like Bergson, especially when the official history that's being written is that luckily the analytic Russell came along and swept away these ridiculous, the mysticism, I guess he calls, of Bergson. There are other reasons in France of the existentialists weren't too kind on Bergson because also he was kind of the big figure they had to take down. But then obviously in France, it had another history with Deleuze reviving Bergson in France in the late 60s. Whereas in the English-speaking world, it's taken a lot longer for people to start thinking, hey, actually, there's something here that is worth looking into.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this wonderful hour of discussion and and a kind of philosophical history of Bergson's life and thought. You did a really wonderful job, really robust presentation of his thought and ideas, and it's not a very easy thing to talk about five separate books in 1 hour when there's so much ideas, and you've done such a wonderful job of bringing Bergson to life for all of the viewers. And I really want to thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great talk.
Well, thank you very much. And Emily's book, you can get it, you can order it. It's fantastic. Do you have it for us so I can
I
read
have
that?
the UK, the US cover is different. This is the UK cover, and the US one it just has the hat. They've done a bit of a Magritte thing with which is very cool as well. But yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I can't wait to get it and read it. And I will post tons of reviews and tons of on social media. So thank you again, and this was great.
Thank you.